Hello and welcome to Subject to Change with me, Russell Hogg. And this is the second part of a two-part podcast that I'm doing with Tristan Hughes of History Hit, all about the death of Alexander and the struggles between the Macedonian commanders that followed. And we'd reached the point where Perdicass was pretty much at the height of his powers, but he'd managed to worry two of the key commanders, Antipater and Craterus in the west, and Ptolemy in Egypt is looking at Perdicass in a very sideways fashion. But nonetheless, I'd say Perdicass is still in control. He still has control of the kings, and he still has control of Alexander's body. So is that a reasonable summation of where we are in the story?
That is. And Perdicass is an arrogant figure. He's getting more and more confident in himself, and he now does have an eye on becoming Alexander's true successor, of becoming King Perdicass.
So tell me about how Perdicass arranges for the burial of the body of Alexander, because presumably that as we sort of said last time, that is a key part in building up the aura of kingship for Perdicass.
It is, absolutely. And as we mentioned in the last episode, Alexander's body by this time has gained this divine importance. It's this key symbol of authority, of legitimacy for those seeking power and prominence in this new unstable post-Alexander world. By this time in 321 BC, Alexander's body has rested in state in Babylon for the past 2 years. And it's been that long because they have been building a funeral carriage unlike anything the world had seen, funded by the coffers of the former Persian Empire, the limitless wealth of the Persian Empire, overseen by Perdicass too. Although Perdicass isn't there, but he obviously, as regent, he orders the construction of this massive funeral carriage. And you see wheelsmiths and people from all across the empire, craftsmen, from all corners of the empire, come together in the royal workshops, and they create this massive funeral carriage on wheels. We have an amazing description of it surviving in Diodorus Siculus, probably from an eyewitness who saw it, maybe someone like Hieronymus of Cardia. But it basically represented a mini Hellenic temple on wheels. So you could see the Hellenic elements on it. There were small statues, there were friezes, there was the vaulted roof, there was the purple cloth and the casket in the middle, but there were also these Asian elements such as the wheels, this wheeled funeral carriage, a very Asian idea. So you have this kind of hybrid combination of ideas in the creation of this elaborate funeral carriage covered in gold, very much to emphasize the divinity, the newfound divinity of Alexander the Great. It takes 2 years to build. The question then is, once it's made and it's ready, is where is it going to be taken to?
But let me just ask a question before we get to where it's going to be taken to.
Yes.
I mean, what is the state of the roads? Because this sounds like an incredibly delicate contraption with statues there. You're thinking, oh my goodness me, I've been over some roads which don't have tarmac on them. Even in a Jeep or something, you get bounced around a lot. I just wonder how they managed to physically move it.
Well, to move it, we're told that they have 64 mules. Each of them has like a gold bell on, and they're clad in gold. But like even with the best suspension, we are told that the escort, which ultimately does take the body from Babylon, is escorted by soldiers, but also engineers and craftspeople, so that they can fix whatever problems come up. And no doubt there would have been problems to try and bring this funeral carriage back to the west. And I don't know the state of the roads.
Well, presumably the engineers could have sort of sorted them mile by mile, because presumably they're not doing a huge distance every day.
Evidently that does happen, because we do know that it moves. Well, we know that there's the Royal Persian Road. We know that the Persian Empire had a very good logistics system, road system, so that probably the Macedonians employed that on their route back. But we don't know exactly the route. But as you say, even with the best suspension, that funeral carriage is not going anywhere quickly.
So where does Perdicass order it to be brought to then?
Well, that's the great point, because initially it seems that it was agreed in Babylon that Alexander was to be buried at the place where Alexander had wished to be buried, apparently, which is completely against Macedonian tradition, because he wants to be buried not in Macedonia, but at Siwa, the Siwa Oasis, modern-day Egypt, ancient Libya, where Alexander the Great had ventured to in 332 BC and been declared, only he goes into the sacred sanctuary of Zeus Ammon, but The Greeks saw this as the local manifest of their god Zeus, the Libyan Ammon. Alexander goes in, and he comes out and he says that he receives all the answers that he wished for, which basically we mostly translate is that he was declared as the son of Ammon, basically then for the son of Zeus. And that's where Alexander wanted to be buried. But Perdiccas does not want that. He orders the carriage, instead of it being taken to Siwa, to be taken to him in Asia Minor. And there are two reasons for that. The first reason is because the figure the closest to Siwa is Ptolemy. And Perdiccas doesn't want an object so valuable as Alexander the Great's corpse getting into the hands of Ptolemy, his rival. Because let's make no mistake, as amazing as that carriage was, the real treasure was the body itself and not the funeral carriage. Instead, Perdiccas wants to retain control of it. He doesn't want it to be seized by Ptolemy, so he orders it to come to him in Asia Minor. And his plan there, it's all part of his great royal scheme. He already has control of the royal army. He has control of the two kings. He has control of Alexander the Great's widow, Roxana. He has Cleopatra waiting in the wings, ready to marry him at Sardis, Alexander the Great's full sister. He just needs the final piece of the puzzle, is actual control of Alexander the Great's body and the funeral carriage. With that, he would then escort it back to Macedonia, to the traditional royal burial grounds at Aigai at Vergina, and oversee the burial of Alexander the Great. And think how that would look. Antipater and Craterus would not be able to contend with it. Perdiccas, returning to Macedonia, in control of the two kings, de facto in control of the royal army, married to Alexander the Great's full sister, Cleopatra, greeted, most likely, by Alexander the Great's mother, Olympias, that mother-daughter team I was talking about, Olympias-Cleopatra team, and in possession of Alexander the Great's corpse and overseeing its burial. All of that combined makes it evident for them to see that Perdiccas is Alexander's true successor. He is the new king, and Antipater and Craterus would not have the power to do anything about it. So that is Perdiccas' great plan.
And it is a great plan, and it's hard to see really what could go wrong, but I'm sure you're going to tell me.
You know what? This is one of the great times in ancient history, which is another of those what-if moments.
Yeah.
Because it is the last play of the die, the last play of the dice, in this case, by Ptolemy. Because Ptolemy knows this just as much, and he knows that if Perdiccas gets to Macedon and becomes Alexander's true successor, his time in control of Egypt is numbered. And so he has to do something, and he has been doing something. Because in the meantime, he has been colluding with the person in charge of the escort of Alexander the Great's funeral carriage from Babylon, a man, confusingly, also called Audacious. Not the brother of Alexander the Great, the king. This is just a general called Audacious, which is really confusing, but I've explained it now. You know what I mean.
Yeah.
So they have been covertly talking and plotting this remarkable heist. I call it the greatest heist in history. I did a documentary about it. Sorry, that was a bit boastful. But I think it is.
Well, it is the greatest heist in history. I don't think there's any two ways about it.
It really is, because of how significant it proves, but it's how little known it is. It is absolutely remarkable. And would you like me to talk it through, Russell?
Yes, please.
So the funeral carriage is making its way towards Perdiccas in Asia Minor, and it reaches, roughly around the area of modern-day Aleppo in Syria, ancient Antioch. Antioch wasn't a thing at that stage, but it will be. And then it takes a detour. Rather than continuing west, it starts heading south through modern-day Syria to places like Damascus, near places like Jerusalem too. So it starts heading down the eastern coastline of the Mediterranean, completely against what Perdiccas had ordered. Now, even though this is a heist, the carriage is not going anywhere fast. So basically, as soon as the carriage starts heading south, the time has started ticking between that carriage's movements and that being reported to Perdiccas in Asia Minor and Perdiccas reacting. And so, not long afterwards, Perdiccas hears word that the funeral carriage has started heading south. And he gets an idea that there is something going on here. There is some sort of heist going on. Why is it not continuing west? So he needs that body. So he gathers a light armed contingent of his soldiers under his trusted adjutants, Attalus and Polemon. They're both brothers, Attalus and Polemon. And they ride quickly in pursuit of the funeral carriage to turn it around by force if necessary and to reroute it back to Perdiccas. But the key thing is that they don't reach the funeral carriage until after the body has reached Damascus, because it would have been there where Ptolemy had already greeted it with his own army. And so by the time that Perdiccas's retrieval force reaches the funeral carriage, they're greeted not just by the escort, but by Ptolemy's mercenary force, which has greatly reinforced it to such an extent that Perdiccas's retrieval force is unable to reroute it. Ptolemy's force is too strong, and it ultimately means that Attalus and Polemon and their soldiers, Perdiccas's soldiers, go back to Perdiccas empty-handed, and the funeral carriage continues down to Egypt. And Attalus and Polemon have to explain to Perdiccas, we couldn't reroute it. Ptolemy was there ahead of us. And it results in the winter of 321-320 BC in not Perdiccas, but Ptolemy, overseeing the burial of Alexander the Great, not in Macedonia, but at Memphis, in Egypt. This is an incredibly slow but incredibly significant heist for what happens in the immediate aftermath of Alexander the Great's death, and it has incredible ramifications for what happened next.
So Perdiccas, presumably now Ptolemy is now openly declared war on him, effectively.
Ptolemy has crossed his Rubicon by this point. He's had no choice, but he has crossed his Rubicon. And he knows that Perdiccas is going to legitimize a war against him, march into Egypt to confront Ptolemy for this great affront, for this seizing of Alexander the Great's corpse. And he has the reasons there to present to his army to say, he's stolen Alexander's body. We are the legitimate cause here. We have been wronged. We are going to take Alexander's body back and we're going to bury it in its rightful place in Macedonia, which you can imagine was very popular with the Macedonians. Also probably other accusations, like Ptolemy was evidently trying to form his own empire, wasn't abiding by the authority of the kings. All those things. So Perdiccas puts forward those proposals. The soldiers rubber stamp it. And so he gathers the royal army, much of the royal army, and he marches along the eastern seaboard of the Mediterranean, and he heads down to Egypt to confront Ptolemy with the main aim of retrieving Alexander the Great's body, and in the process, defeating Ptolemy, getting rid of Ptolemy.
How strong is Ptolemy militarily? Because my sense of Egypt is that it's a very wealthy place, but it's not what I regard as a military power. But maybe at that time in history, it was just, my understanding is just wrong.
No, you're not at all. He's strong, but he's not as strong as Perdiccas, I think is the simple way to put it. He has a significant, several thousand mercenary troops. Remember I mentioned he had all that money in the previous episode, so he's been able to hire more. There are some stories that him having control of Alexander's body leads to some Macedonians coming to Egypt and enlisting in his service. Maybe, but probably not too many. And I think we do know that later, a few years later, he does enlist Egyptians in his army. I think he does at the Battle of Gaza. That's a few years down the line. So he might have employed Egyptians too, but Ptolemy's army is nowhere near as big as Perdiccas's royal army. That is the army. That is the grand army of the time. But what he does have is the River Nile. And what he does have is defences along the River Nile preventing the crossings. So he has geographically what he lacks in military manpower. He has more in abundance in geographical position.
And what's Craterus and was it Antipater doing at this point?
This is the interesting other thing. As this is all going on, Antipater and Craterus they've reached a peace deal with the Aetolians. They're back in Macedonia. They're gathering their own forces in preparation for an attack to invade Asia Minor. And there seems to be Antipater is still a bit hesitant at this point. He's not sure whether he actually really wants to or not. He still is hopeful, I think, of this triumvirate. Antipater is remarkable because amongst all these people who were very ambitious at the time, Ptolemy, Perdiccas, even Craterus, to become really prominent figures in the empire or to become the dominant figure, Antipater doesn't have that same ambitious streak to such an effect. I mean, in the events following this war, Antipater is notable for giving command of the royal army to someone else that is not him, and him actually going back to Macedonia. He's an old guy, he's a remarkable guy, but he's a very old guy at the moment. So he doesn't share. I think he's still very much hoping out that actually Perdiccas, these rumours aren't true, and actually still wants to work in tandem with Craterus and Antipater. But Antigonus is the warmonger again in this case, because he goes ahead of Antipater and Craterus to Asia Minor. He forms a bridgehead, he returns early, and he starts gaining the control of cities on Asia Minor's western coastline. And in the process of doing so, he hears confirmation, he hears news that Perdiccas is now accelerating the marriage to Cleopatra. Perdiccas now, on the eve of him going to Egypt, had decided to just shun Nicaea and let's just marry Cleopatra when I'm done, and let's send all these gifts to Cleopatra in Sardis to kind of affirm, let's get married. And Antigonus hears word of it. He almost captures Eumenes, Perdiccas's adjutant, who was overseeing this mission, when he's in Sardis conversing with Cleopatra. He doesn't succeed, but the key damage there is that he now has more concrete confirmation that Perdiccas does intend to marry Cleopatra. That gets back to Antipater and Craterus in Macedonia, and that's the final straw for Antipater and Craterus. And they prepare a large army to invade Asia Minor, to cross the Hellespont, the Dardanelles, at the same time as Perdiccas is already heading towards Egypt.
So is this a problem for Perdiccas, or can he finish off Ptolemy first and then come back and deal with Antipater and Craterus?
I think that's his main aim. His main aim is to defeat Ptolemy first, as you say, and then to deal with Antipater and Craterus. He does leave a force in Anatolia, in Asia Minor, in the meantime, and that is commanded by Eumenes, but also helped by Perdiccas' brother, Alcetas, and several other figures too. They are left in charge of Asia Minor in the meantime. Perdiccas' ace up his sleeve, or at least he believes, is that at time he has control of the royal fleet. And Antipater and Craterus have to cross a waterway if they're to get into Asia Minor. Perdiccas has sent his fleets, the royal fleet under the name of the command of an admiral called Clytus the White, to retain control of the Hellespont in the meantime. And so long as that force is there, Antipater and Craterus cannot cross into Asia Minor. They can hold them there almost like a plug, whilst Perdiccas deals with Ptolemy and then comes back to deal with them in Asia Minor. But sadly, it doesn't quite go that way.
What do you mean by that? Because
this is a time of very ambitious individuals where the loyalty of these individuals to someone goes only as far as they're winning battles and as they're in a regime where they're able to advance their own careers, their own ambitions. Clytus the White had been seems he had proven his loyalty to Perdiccas and had been given command of the royal fleet. But when Antipater reaches the Hellespont, he negotiates with Clytus the White. And I think it's very much he offers to give Clytus the White a high position in the new regime that would follow Perdiccas' downfall. And he convinces Clytus the White to defect with the fleet. And so in the blink of an eye, Eumenes, who has an army the other side of the Hellespont, sees the fleet defect, and all of a sudden there's nothing barring Antipater and his huge army with Craterus, which could beat Eumenes on the open field, from crossing to Asia Minor. And so the fleet defects to Antipater. It's an incredibly significant moment in this first War of the Successors. And Antipater and Craterus with their army cross over into Asia Minor. They also link up with Antigonus, who is joined by his own force in Asia Minor. And now Perdiccas has the problem, the fact that his forces in Asia Minor are quite split apart, and they are confronted by this huge force of Antipater and Craterus with lots and lots of Macedonian soldiers, veterans of Alexander's campaigns in there too. And there's not much to stop them from keeping going eastwards as Perdiccas is still dealing with Ptolemy in Egypt. So that's the problem which happens. Basically, it's the lack of loyalty of Clytus the White that really affects the Perdican cause. Let's just call them the Perdicans, these supporters of Perdiccas in Asia Minor. The Perdican cause in Asia Minor, in Anatolia.
And what kind of a general does Eumenes prove to be then? Because he's up against pretty stiff odds, it sounds.
He's up against a man who's considered the greatest general of the age, Craterus, and also a veteran general who has clout, who has respect, that can't really be rivaled by any apart from Craterus and Perdiccas. And a huge army numbering the tens of thousands. And, alongside that, Antigonus, who is not as significant as Antipater and Craterus, but he is still a very prominent figure, and he's already made some headway in this war with the securing of the coastline. Eumenes has nowhere near as much clout. He was the former personal secretary of Alexander the Great. He had some military experience. He had served as a cavalry commander of Alexander the Great, particularly during Alexander's later years when campaigning in India. But he had nowhere near as much admiration, reputation, renown as the likes of Antipater and Craterus. And yet, against all of the odds, he wins this incredible victory against part of the force. He defeats Craterus. Craterus and Antipater, Their campaign goes well for a bit in Asia Minor, and then Eumenes starts being a thorn in their side. Even though there is trouble in Eumenes' ranks, one of his adjutants, a man called Neoptolemus, defects and tries to kill Eumenes, but is defeated by Eumenes, and Eumenes takes control of his army. Neoptolemus flees to Antipater and Craterus and says, help me defeat Eumenes. And they don't think he's going to be much of a problem, Eumenes. Neoptolemus says, oh, you guys are going to be easily able to defeat Eumenes. Craterus, you're the great famous Craterus. Eumenes would have no trouble, has no chance against you. And his praising convinces Craterus and Antipater to go after Eumenes in Asia Minor. But Eumenes was also going to threaten their logistics supply lines if they left him unhindered anyway. Antipater, they divide their army. Antipater keeps progressing with part of the army. Craterus, with some 20,000 or 30,000 soldiers, I think, heads after Eumenes. Eumenes' army, on paper, looks nothing, can't compete. His infantry, at least, is nowhere near the standard of Craterus' veteran Macedonians. Eumenes' infantry is largely Asian recruits, some mercenaries, but nowhere near as many Macedonians, and nowhere near as many that could rival the great phalanx of Craterus. But what he does have is a strength in cavalry. And what he also does have is a great skill in espionage and hiding the name of Craterus from his troops. So much so that Eumenes...
Sorry, when you say hiding the name of Craterus from his troops, you mean that Eumenes doesn't tell his own troops that Craterus is coming because he's frightened of the name of Craterus?
Yes, exactly so. Because he has this high renown, he stops enemy scouts from reporting this. He spreads his own rumours that actually the person who's coming against them is Neoptolemus, along with another figure called Pigres. We don't know who Pigres is. But it's a deception. It's a huge deception. It's an incredible deception how he's able to do it. But he seems to succeed. And the sources are remarkable because they talk about this part of the First Successor War. And it's brilliant because, well, it's horrible, but it's extraordinary in its own right. And it is kind of Game of Thronesy. It's the underdog story, which everyone loves. This is why the Eumenes of Cardia story is, of all the stories when people start reading this aftermath of Alexander the Great's death, the one that so many people find the most interesting because he is up against so much and yet proves so incredible. After a few days of Craterus pursuing Eumenes gathering his army and concealing the name of Craterus, they ultimately do come into a battle. But Eumenes, by hiding the name of Craterus and Craterus thinking that as soon as Eumenes' troops see him that they're going to go to his side, what happens is catastrophe for Craterus. He, with his cavalry, goes a bit ahead of his main army. Neoptolemus on the other wing goes a bit ahead of their army, the other wing. So these two wings with their own big squadrons, they go ahead to try and announce themselves to Eumenes' army and hopefully to just see them defect or run away there and then. But that doesn't happen. And what Eumenes is very good at is as a cavalry commander. And Eumenes' strength is not in his infantry, it's in his cavalry, particularly his Cappadocian cavalry, which are loyal to him, some 6,000 of them. I think in total, maybe not that many actually, I might be exaggerating a bit. But he has a significant portion and they're elite, they are expert cavalry, they are more than a match for the Macedonian heavy cavalry of Craterus and the cavalry of Neoptolemus on either wing. And so rather than seeing the Macedonians, when they see Craterus, them heading over to them, or any of the soldiers seeing Craterus in his gleaming armour, thinking, oh, that must be Craterus, and then running away. Rather than that, Craterus is greeted by a horde of cavalrymen, some 2,000 cavalry, seeing Craterus and his rather exposed group of horsemen, and just charging straight away. That's what they've been told to do. As soon as you see the enemy, you get over this knoll of the hill because they are behind the knoll of the hill, so they only come into view a bit late. As soon as you see the enemy, charge like never before. And that's what they do. It's aided by the fact that in the cavalry that charges Craterus, there are no Macedonians. It's all Asian cavalry, Cappadocians and so on. So maybe the figure of Craterus does not have as much clout, as much of an impact on them as it would for Macedonians. And so what happens is rather than those soldiers turning over to Craterus having been led to believe that this was going to happen because of Neoptolemus, instead he is greeted by a full-on cavalry charge. He, typical Macedonian in fashion, leading from the front, rather than going back to the cavalry, he's got to lead from the front. He rallies his men and they countercharge. And so you have this cavalry clash in the middle, which ultimately results in Craterus being killed.
It must have been an incredible sight, all these thousands and thousands of horses in this huge charge and countercharge and melee. It must have been an absolutely remarkable sight.
I do think it's the stuff of Noah's series, that battle in particular, when you see them coming over the hill, and it is that charge and that counter charge, and you can imagine, you get the sources, Craterus cursing the name of Neoptolemus, then him going back to those people who are around him, those soldiers who had served with him for so long, him rallying his troops, this inspirational leader, this paragon of military virtue, saying, we've never run from a fight, we're not going to start running now, follow me, men, to... It's kind of, I don't want to glorify it at all, anything like that, but it's because it'd be wrong to do that. But it's you can imagine that scene of what they think, what they thought to glory, to victory or whatever, and then the counter charge and the spears and the clashing and that terrible melee that would have followed, which is just escalated by the fact that as soon as that's happening, another battle erupts on the other wing where Neoptolemus is, where Eumenes is against him. Eumenes and Neoptolemus are big enemies. And at the same time as Neoptolemus sees Craterus having to fight his own skirmish, he is confronted by Eumenes charging with his own cavalry guard, and Neoptolemus wanting to kill Eumenes. The red mist descends, and he leads his own cavalry in a separate countercharge. And so on either wing, the infantry of both sides are nowhere to be seen. They're not involved in the fight. It's just the two cavalry clashes on either wing against each other. Eumenes versus Neoptolemus on one wing, Craterus versus Eumenes' adjutants and his non-Macedonian cavalry on the other wing, which is basically the climax of this of this infamous clash.
And what happens?
So it doesn't end well for Craterus. We have a number of sources which have varying accounts of how he died. Some of them say that he falls off his horse and is trodden to death. We don't know how he died, but it seems to me most likely that he is there in his striking arms and armour that he meant to, awe, and he's very visible. And so he's obviously a target for these people. It's most likely that he's fighting and then he's overwhelmed, falls to the floor, where the infamous fate of many people who fall to the floor in the midst of a chaotic cavalry melee happens. He's probably trampled under the feet of all of these horse hooves. And as soon as that happens, or just after that, Craterus's men see that their legendary general has fallen. They leg it. The horsemen pursuing them follow in pursuit. Craterus's body is noticed by one figure, a Macedonian, because there were a couple of Macedonian generals who were leading that part of the army. It is a man called, what is his name? Gorgias, that is it, Gorgias. And he sees Craterus's body and he supposedly guards Craterus's body as this sign of respect for this hero to make sure it doesn't have any further blows. Whether he's dead or dying at this point is unclear. So Craterus's cavalry flee. On the other wing, you have Neoptolemus and Eumenes clashing. There's great hatred of these two figures and the people that surround them, and ultimately going into a duel where they spot each other. Go on then.
This is too good to be true that they would have an actual duel between the two individuals. It's just the stuff of legends.
It is stuff of legend, and it's told in both Diodorus and Plutarch. And I mean, single combat is no novel concept for these figures.
If you're leading from the front.
Well, yes, and also the fact that they've grown up reading stuff like the Iliad, Homer. So they were Homeric tales of like not Paris, Hector fighting Achilles and so on and so forth. We know of several adjutants of Alexander the Great who fought Persian commanders and so on and so forth, supposedly in single combat before. And Eumenes and Neoptolemus probably standing out with their beautiful steeds. I don't know if you've seen the artwork at the front of my book is a beautiful depiction created by Johnny Shoemate, which is supposed to depict Eumenes and Neoptolemus fighting against each other in the midst of this melee. But they spot each other and they charge against each other. And Diodorus and Plutarch both include this very dramatic event, perhaps seen by an eyewitness, maybe someone like Hieronymus of Cardia, who I mentioned earlier. He is at that time serving alongside Eumenes. So it may well have been that this did happen because an eyewitness saw it and then documents it as he sees it. They fight first of all on horseback, and then they grapple with each other. They fall off their horses and they're fighting against each other on the ground. Eumenes gets the upper hand. He delivers a blow to Neoptolemus. He thinks he's finished off Neoptolemus. Then Neoptolemus, he gets this second wind. He stabs Eumenes in the thigh. Eumenes reacts by delivering the final blow to Neoptolemus, and Eumenes is the victor of this single combat with Neoptolemus, and ultimately it results in Neoptolemus' cavalry running. So Eumenes wins on that flank, and his subordinates win on the other flank. And in that story, in that battle, you have the death of Craterus, and you have this supposed epic duel between Neoptolemus and Eumenes, which Eumenes wins. So his story, just like goes on steroids just in those few moments, really.
Yeah, and not bad for the personal secretary, right? I mean, though as you say, he was a bit more military than that, but still.
No, he's an extraordinary figure, yeah.
So that's sort of the lesser man between, on the Perdican side. So Perdicass, he's still marching into Egypt at this stage?
Yeah, I mean, the key thing for Eumenes is that Crassus dies. So one of these three titanic figures in the aftermath of Alexander the Great's death has already perished in the war. Eumenes is unable to do anything else apart from that because Antipater still has a sizable army, and Antipater just keeps marching towards Syria and so on. So Eumenes has done his part. He's dealt a significant blow to his enemies, but he can't do anything more after that. The new main theatre is, of course, Egypt, as you say. Perdiccas marches to Egypt, and he gets to the Pelusium, the easternmost branch of the River Nile, where he's confronted by Ptolemy. That's the climax of the First War of the Successors. That's what happens next.
So Perdiccas, he's got the bigger army?
Perdiccas has got the bigger army, but he has to cross the Nile. And opposing him along the length and breadth of the Pelusiac branch of the River Nile, where it's most easy to cross, Ptolemy has basically prepped every crossing point with a fort. And most forts were there already by the ancient Egyptians and the Persians who'd ruled Egypt before, and then the native Egyptian pharaohs before them. And he's put significant garrisons in each one of them. And at the same time, the Nile's not that wide. Ptolemy will be shadowing Perdiccas' every move with his own main army, watching where Perdiccas goes, and then reinforcing the crossing wherever Perdiccas decides to cross, and then them having the clash. So there will be a battle on the banks of the Nile, come what may.
And Perdiccas, so he needs to cross the Nile to get at his opponent, right? That's his aim.
Absolutely, and ultimately to get to Memphis, where Alexander the Great's body is, he will sooner or later have to cross the River Nile. That there is no doubt that has to happen. He tries initially to dredge one of the canals, but that fails. Maybe because of the machinations of Ptolemy, we're not quite sure. The results in the flooding of his contraption, so that backfires completely. And then Perdiccas heads a bit further upriver, roughly 10 kilometres from Pelusium, because we hear he does it at night, to try and get a head start over Ptolemy. And Perdiccas' army had elephants in it, so he couldn't have gone really any further than that within a night. But he does the night march, so much so that roughly about 4 o'clock in the morning, just as the sun is rising, he gets to a fort called the Camel Fort. And he begins crossing immediately with his elite Macedonian soldiers. They're carrying ladders, with the elephants as well in front to bash down the gates, with the cavalry behind, and to try and secure the crossing before Ptolemy arrives with his main force and makes it all that much more difficult.
Why has he not got any boats?
He's not got any boats because the River Nile, at that point he's unable to get his navy, the Royal Navy, up that branch of the River Nile. So instead he leaves the Royal Navy under the command of one of his most reliable generals, Attalus, the same Attalus I mentioned earlier, who's part of the retrieval force of Alexander the Great's body, in command of the fleet. Attalus will be important in the aftermath of what ultimately happens in Egypt, but he doesn't play any more part in the story. Perdiccas doesn't have any boats. You need time to make boats to cross the River Nile. He doesn't have that time. He has to attack. He has to forward straight away. But this is a part of the River Nile where it's not difficult to ford. It's also in June time, so the Nile is relatively low. So it is literally just wading through.
So it does sound like he's in a pretty good shape. He's got his elephants, he's got his elite infantry, they're making the crossing, they're in good shape, and yet something tells me it's not going to go as well as Perdiccas would have wanted.
No, because Ptolemy arrives in the nick of time. And he and his soldiers get into the fort and significantly reinforce the soldiers who are manning that fort. Perdiccas still calls on the attack, but his cavalry, he'd wanted his cavalry across to basically form a blockade between the fort and Ptolemy's approaching army, but they don't get there in time, so Ptolemy manages to get to the fort. So it becomes all that much harder for Perdiccas, but he still persists. You can imagine him leading from the front, maybe not right from the start, but he is definitely there as the day goes on, because what we hear is there is a significant bloody struggle from dawn till dusk that day, as the Macedonian soldiers of Perdiccas, probably other contingents too, the Macedonians just a small part, but they are an elite part. They put ladders against the walls, they struggle for control of the fort, battling against Ptolemy's mercenary defenders. We hear at times that Perdiccas seems to be getting the upper hand of his soldiers. They start getting a place on the wall, but then Ptolemy and his forces beat them back. Ptolemy is inspiring them by him being there too. You can imagine Perdiccas being that side of the river, inspiring his troops to go forwards. These two former generals who are so used to leading from the front all of the time. But it ultimately results in Ptolemy's forces winning the day, that day, and then beating back Perdiccas' army across the River Nile, and the fort holding. The battle lasts from dawn till dusk, but Ptolemy is ultimately the victor of it.
So that's round one. Perdicass doesn't sound to me like the kind of man who's going to give up, and I guess he can't give up at this stage.
No, and this is such an interesting time, because really, Perdiccas has the manpower, if he wants, to just keep on going, launch another assault the next day, and slowly wear away Ptolemy's forces. He'd done that before in sieging a hill fort, a fort in southeastern Turkey just the previous year, and it had worked. Within 3 days, the fort had fallen. But instead, he decides to do something completely different. He decides to keep marching upriver to Memphis, and rather than attempt another attack on the fort, which seems a bit, very interesting, but we just don't have the details surviving, which kind of explains why he doesn't persist. Maybe resources, maybe he needed to move his army to kind of keep the resources flowing. Maybe there was more significant reinforcements coming to that fort, which just meant it was a very impossible place to attack once Ptolemy was there. But it ultimately results in Perdiccas, for 2 weeks or so, just marching down that eastern side of the River Nile, all the way down to almost opposite Memphis, and then deciding that he's going to cross there. Now, this is away from the Nile Delta, so the River Nile here is much deeper, and it's at a place where Ptolemy hasn't erected any defences as such, no fort, because it's not a clear crossing point for an army. But it's June, or July by this point, so the River Nile is not too difficult, but it is still very difficult to get across. But it is possible for him to cross it, and only just. And what makes it easier is that there is an island. Between Perdiccas and the other bank, there is an island, so roughly 3/4 of the way across. So if you can get to that island, then it's job done, because the remaining gap between that island and the far bank is not going to be a problem for any army to cross. It's just that first part, with the fast-flowing current and the deeper water, which will be the most of a problem for Perdiccas. But he gets there. Ptolemy's nowhere in sight at the moment. Memphis is just over the other side of the river. That's where Alexander's body is. That's the ultimate prize. So it may well be that actually the reason that Perdiccas didn't have a second go at the camel fall was because his ultimate aim is Alexander the Great's body. And so he thinks, actually, let's just get to Memphis as quickly as possible and deal with Ptolemy later. What he does to deal with this deeper water and faster flowing current at the time is he follows in the footsteps of Alexander, which is he puts his animals in the river to slow the current. Alexander had done this whilst crossing the Tigris River almost a decade earlier, when Alexander put his horses upriver and downriver. Upriver to slow the current, downriver to pick any of his soldiers which lost their footing during the crossing. Perdiccas thinks he goes one better. He puts his elephants upriver and he puts his horses downriver to collect any figures who lose their footing. And for a time this works. This elephant shield reduces the speed and the depth of the water of the River Nile, and it makes the River Nile crossable. And it works for a time. He's able to get a few thousand of his soldiers, mainly his elite Macedonian soldiers, across to the island first, his elite vanguard. But it all goes terribly wrong, because what Perdiccas didn't realise was that underneath the water at the same time, the feet of the elephants and the feet of all these soldiers marching across this new ford, this new crossing place, displaces the soil, the sand underneath the water to such an extent that the current starts getting stronger, the Nile starts getting deeper and deeper and deeper again, and lo and behold, soon enough, the Nile is no longer crossable there. And Perdiccas has the terrible conundrum that his army is now divided. Some of it has reached the island, the rest of it is still with him on the far bank. And this is a big conundrum for Perdiccas, which is only, you would think if he had a day or two, he would be able to solve it, maybe a temporary bridge, pontoon or something like that. But he doesn't have the time, because he sees in the distance on the opposite bank this great dust cloud approaching. And he goes immediately to panic. He thinks this is a huge army of Ptolemy that's approaching, that's just going to wipe out his soldiers that had reached the island. In fact, it's a complete ruse. It is Ptolemy's army, but it's nowhere near as big as the dust cloud suggests, because actually, in fact, he's got all his pack animals, his baggage animals, and they'd got he put like bits of furniture or baggage or whatever, and they drag them along the sand in front of his army to evoke this huge army approaching, when in fact it was just all these pack animals, causing all this sand and dust to go into the air. But Perdiccas doesn't know that, and he panics, and he orders the soldiers to come back from the island, bugle horns with signals or whatever. And the soldiers oblige. They throw off their arms and armour, and they try to get across this much faster flowing current. It's a disaster. Some of the better swimmers do manage to make it back across. Many of the others drown or are carried downstream, where they arguably get a worse fate. Well, drowning's pretty bad. Drowning's pretty bad, but the other fate's pretty bad as well, because those figures who are flown downriver are eaten alive by crocodiles. And it's a terrible, terrible, terrible end. It's disastrous for Perdiccas. According to Diodorus, he loses some 1,000 soldiers, maybe more than 1,000.
And they're his best soldiers, right?
They are some of his best soldiers. These are people who had served with Alexander the Great for years. They've been to the edges of the known world and further. They've survived all these countless hardships to only be defeated by the River Nile, by a stupid decision by their commander, which has resulted in some of them having the worst fate imaginable, which is being eaten alive by crocodiles. And why that's so bad is because a key role of a Macedonian commander was to oversee the burial of your dead. And you can't oversee the burial of your dead if they've been eaten completely. There's nothing to bury. And this is seen as a great sacrilege. Their brothers in arms, the Macedonian soldiers who aren't eaten, who have seen their comrades for many years just be eaten alive or drown, basically they think they're just wandering enough in purgatory. They don't get to go to the afterlife. And this is terrible. It's a big stain on Perdiccas's ability to command them, his capability to do so. And this leads to Perdiccas's downfall. There is no coming back from this. Even though he hasn't confronted Perdiccas, this defeat by the Nile, this significant defeat by the Nile, that night Perdiccas is assassinated because the soldiers are so infuriated with him, and the level of anger among the Macedonians, perhaps less so amongst the most numerous part of his army, but that doesn't matter at the moment. For the Macedonian generals, it's the voices of the Macedonian soldiers, the elite soldiers, that matters. And the commanders conspire. That night, Perdiccas is defiant, but his arrogant tone just annoys them further. And so they decide to hop on this anger train that is erupting amongst the Macedonian soldiers, the rank and file. And they go to his tent, a few of the commanders. It's debated who lands the first blow. Apparently it's a man called Antigenes, the commander of the Silver Shields, the elite Macedonian infantryman. But whatever happens, the likes of Seleucus, who is Perdiccas' second in command, a remarkable figure who we haven't talked about today, but he is an extraordinary figure who will rise in the following years and had been exceptionally loyal to Perdiccas up to that point. It's only following the Nile disaster that he decides to turn. And another guy called Python, very prominent figure, Python, they assassinate Perdiccas and they reach a reconciliation with Ptolemy in the days following. But that is the end of Perdiccas. He reaches a gruesome end that is ultimately down to one terrible, terrible decision on the banks of the River Nile in July 320 BC.
It is incredible, isn't it? He doesn't actually lose the battle exactly. He
loses the battle against nature. He loses the battle against himself in a weird way, yeah. It's terrible.
And in a way, part of the tragedy, I suppose, is that the wars of the successors, I mean, you've got a whole library to write after this one.
Well, yes, I'm slowly working my way through what happens next. So my book finishes with the aftermath of Perdiccas' death and the reconciliation. I'm now on to the second one, which is Triparadisus and the new settlement that emerges. Because another key thing to highlight here is that this first war has resulted in the death of two of the three great titans of the aftermath of Alexander's death, in the form of Craterus and Perdiccas. So there's only one chief figure left, and that's Antipater. And he obviously takes a prominent role in the settlement that follows at a place called Triparadisus, which I'm now researching and looking at for the next book. But
you don't count Ptolemy as one of the great.
The removal of Craterus and Perdiccas paves the way for the rise of these new prominent figures. So Ptolemy and Antigonus, you can also, if you're looking at a pyramid, you've got Craterus, Antipater and Perdicass on the top, and then Ptolemy and Antigonus, maybe Lysimachus and Python and the like on the next rank down. Ptolemy's defeating of Perdicass, his retaining of Alexander the Great's body, him now being able to say that Egypt is my spear, one land, but I'll still honour the kings. That basically rises him up basically to the same level as Antipater. Antigonus is the same. His role in the First War of the Successors, his role in Western Asia Minor, and his own independent campaign, which he is very successful in Cyprus. As this is all happening, he fights the Perdican forces in Cyprus and he's victorious. That makes him also on the top table. So you get rid of Perdicass and Craterus, and they're replaced by Antigonus and Ptolemy. And you will see other new figures really rising to the fore in the years following too. Figures like, to an extent, Python, but also Eumenes, maybe Seleucus as well. But really, with the vacuum that the deaths of Perdicass and Craterus, these strong men, creates, allows for the rise of Ptolemy and Antigonus.
And the carnage continues.
Carnage continues, indeed, indeed.
Tristan, that was a tour de force, an absolute bloody tour de force. So your generosity with your time is just fantastic. So thank you so much.
You're very welcome. It was a great pleasure to do it. So thank you once again for asking me.
Well, that's the end of today's podcast. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, then I have a big favour to ask. I don't look to make any money from the podcast. There's no advertising or anything like that. I just do this because I enjoy speaking to the guests, and I'm keen for them to get as big a audience as possible, because I think they are really, really good people. So if you could share it on whatever social media channel you use, tweet it out, whatever it is, and even better if you could leave a review on iTunes, that would be absolutely fantastic. Anyway, goodbye for now.